watching India Sense. I'm Gaurie, Dwivedi. Before we get to the big story, Prime Minister Modi's visit to Ukraine, let's get you the headlines. First up, Prime Minister Modi is in Ukraine, making him one of the few world leaders to be in Russia and Ukraine since the conflict started in February 2022. PM Modi makes a pitch for peace, reiterates it's not a time of war. Will India be able to achieve the possible breakthrough in talks? Kamala Harris officially becomes the Democrat nominee for the presidential elections, will take on Donald Trump on 5th of November. In a 40-minute speech, Kamala invokes her mother and her Indian roots, vows a new way forward. This brings down curtains on the star-studded Democrat National Convention. Amidst unprecedented rains in Tripura and parts of Bangladesh, Dhaka accuses New Delhi of deliberately releasing water from the Dumbur Dam. External Affairs Ministry rejects this claim, saying repeated and regular communication was maintained by India. India on high alert as Thailand reports first case of the latest mutant of the highly contagious Mpox virus. This comes after roughly 14,000 cases of Mpox have been reported around the world, even as questions remain whether lessons have been learned on how to deal with a global epidemic. An Indian bus with 40 passengers plunged into Nepal's Marsyandi River in Tahan district. As per local police, 14 people have died so far. The bus was travelling from Pokhara to Kathmandu. Relief and rescue operations underway. Few nations can claim to share a good rapport with two warring sides as India can. 6 weeks after Prime Minister Modi met Russian President Vladimir Putin, he has met the Ukrainian President today, Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Officially, the agenda on the table was not shared in advance, but the hope and expectation was that a possible breakthrough for a settlement could be achieved. New Delhi, with its diplomatic heft, economic might and an independent foreign policy, is probably best placed to start that process. Of course, a lot needs to be done to get any negotiations going for a possible settlement, but the fact that the process needs to start itself is a very important aspect. First, listen in to what Prime Minister Modi said today in Ukraine after he met the Ukrainian president, and then we talk more on this big story.
भारत हमेशा फर्स्ट रिस्पॉन्डर के रूप में सामने आता है। साथियों, भारत बुद्ध की विरासत वाली धरती है। और जब बुद्ध की बात आती है तो जो युद्ध नहीं, शांति पर विश्वास करती है। और इसलिए भारत इस रीजन में भी स्थायी शांति का एक बड़ा पैरोकार है। भारत का मत एकदम साफ है, ये युद्ध का युग नहीं है।
All right, the two visits of the Prime Minister to Russia and Ukraine were 6 weeks apart, but there was a lot of optics and which were completely different between these two visits. During his Moscow visit, Prime Minister Modi paid respects at the tomb of the unknown soldier, but did not visit any memorial for Russian soldiers who lost their lives during this 2.5-year-long conflict. But today, Prime Minister Modi visited the exposition on children at the National Museum of History of Ukraine in Kiev. It was set up in memory of the children who had lost their lives in the conflict. This symbolism is testimony to India's position, which is that it wants this war that has been going on for 2.5 years to end, and India wants that both sides should come together, come on the negotiating table and finalize a settlement to end human misery, to end this conflict's biggest casualties, which are the civilians. Listen in to what External Affairs Minister Jaishankar had to say about this important visit.
There have been a number of public positions taken by India and by the Prime Minister on this subject. A little more than 2 years ago, he had actually publicly said that this is not an era of war. He had also underlined that dialogue and diplomacy are the key. Most recently, he emphasized that the solution will not come out of the battlefield. And obviously, we find the civilian and humanitarian toll of this conflict particularly distressing. It's also India's view that the two sides need to engage each other to find a solution.
Now, prior to the Kursk region incursion by Ukraine, it seemed that Russia was open to a possible settlement to the long-drawn conflict. But that window may have possibly shrunk now. But like any other global conflict, the Russia-Ukraine conflict could also be settled if all stakeholders agree on a consensus. Now, there's UK, US, Germany, France, Russia, Ukraine, which are essentially the main stakeholders for this conflict. And for any negotiation to succeed, besides national security concerns, they all would need to create some good optics for their domestic audiences. Remember, there's also politics involved. And what India can do is start that process. As the largest oil importer of Russian oil, India has enough and more leverage over Moscow. And as a key voice of the global south, it can actually bring Ukraine on the table. That's the role that India can play. Now, specifically in terms of the optics for each of these stakeholders, for US, any settlement will allow Joe Biden to claim victory. So important since the domestic election cycle essentially talks a lot about Putin. It features very prominently the Russian president. For UK, France and Germany, it will mean end of a war that has forced the continent, the entire European continent, to ramp up its defense spends to 19% of their GDP from sub 5%. Look at the expenses they've all incurred. And for Putin, if he manages to retain the Donbass region, that's a huge win. As far as Zelenskyy is concerned, the Kursk region invasion is essentially his leverage to ensure that Ukraine gets back some of its territory that it has lost in this entire 2.5-year conflict. For India, its role as a facilitator will be its biggest win, cementing its position and role as a leader of the global south, integral to the new world order, where New Delhi does not need to have a P5 membership to be on the high-stakes table. The end of the conflict will allow closer collaboration in setting up joint ventures in defense manufacturing between India and Ukraine. They could work on tank engines, fighter jets manufacturing, as some of the other specific areas. All right, shifting focus to the first wide-angle story on the show. Kamala Harris, who's half Indian on her mother's side, has been officially announced as the Democrat presidential candidate to take on Donald Trump in an election that may go down to the wire. First up, listen in to what Kamala Harris had to say in her speech as she officially accepted the Democrat nomination.
Consider his explicit intent to set free violent extremists, the power he will have, especially after the United States Supreme Court just ruled that he would be immune from criminal prosecution. Donald Trump tried to throw away your votes. But America, we are not going back. We are not going back. We are not going back. In many ways, Donald Trump is an unserious man. We are not going back to when Donald Trump tried to cut Social Security and Medicare. We are not going to let him eliminate the Department of Education that funds our public schools. America, we are not going back.
Now, Kamala Harris is riding high on the renewed energy and positivity that the Democrat campaign has had ever since Joe Biden exited the race. But this will give way to some hard questions that Harris and her campaign needs to find answers to. For one, Harris came into the race much after the primaries endorsed Joe Biden, indicated that she is a selected and not really an elected candidate, and some voters may perceive her as a parachute candidate. Secondly, Harris's campaign has been low on specifics, economic policy for one, and has pretty much been an extension of Joe Biden's agenda. What this means? Well, it exposes her to all the critique of Joe Biden's policies. And lastly, what's really her plan to woo the undecided voters or the fence-sitters? As per the latest CBS YouGov poll that you will see on your screens, 7% of Harris voters say that they might consider Trump. Likewise, 8% of Trump voters say they may do so for the Democrat candidate, which is now Kamala Harris. And in total, 7% of all likely voters are persuadable. That means they could shift their stance. And this is enough, since only a small fraction of many undecided voters who are younger, possibly first-timers, can actually swing the presidential election. The previous two elections, one in which Trump won and one in which he lost, both were decided by less than 5 percentage points, and it was these fence-sitters who really decided. Interestingly, 1 in 8 voters are unsure of their votes. This is a voter segment that's more diverse, open to political positions on the basis of the policies of each of the candidates, and need answers to the classic question, which is, what's in it for me? And they may not have voted also in the previous elections. And this is that voter base that Harris needs to now address with specific policy agenda. And the poll also says that most know what Trump stands for, but they do not know what Harris's positions are. So her task is now cut out for her to now really convert this entire momentum into a victory. She needs to find answers to those specific questions. Shifting focus now to the second wide-angle story of this episode, which is the rise of monkeypox or Mpox cases. Thailand becomes the first country in Asia to report the latest mutant of the Mpox variant, and this variant is more deadly, it is more contagious. Elaborate measures are now being put in place even in India to ensure that the spread is contained, it does not spread at all. And anticipatory measures are being taken. A 14-bed isolation ward has been created in Mumbai's Seven Hills Hospital. But despite the global Mpox outbreak 2 years ago, which affected over 1 lakh people in 116 countries, the larger question is that regulation of animal markets is still not being done. Remember, it's Mpox. It's come from the same animal market and the same area, which remains a concern. In fact, zoonotic diseases is one of the focus areas of WHO in its global health plan, which has fallen flat due to zero consensus amongst rich and poor countries. How bad is it? Well, take a look at this report to tell you just how much is politics hampering a global health treaty that may prevent such outbreaks or at least minimize the impact on the entire humanity. Years after the WHO declared COVID-19 as a pandemic, the world is hoping that the same mistakes will not be repeated. In March 2024, 194 countries met to finalize a global treaty. The treaty aims to enhance global cooperation, data sharing, and better response measures to any future global outbreaks. Elaborate pandemic prevention measures include surveillance for emerging pathogens, access to better sanitation, infection control, and better regulation of animal markets. But despite 9 rounds of negotiations, a consensus on a global treaty remains elusive due to geopolitical tensions and differing national interests. Talks have been slow due to disagreements over intellectual property rights of pharma companies and resource allocation, since COVID saw rich countries prioritize their own citizens. Unlike last time around, the what needs to be done has now been clearly defined. But exactly like last time, how do we do it together has only rejoined us. The monkeypox outbreak shows that what's needed is an overhaul of the world's health architecture. But as things stand right now, it's each country for itself. All right, we're slipping into a very short break. We come back on the other side of India Sense with the latest in the India-Bangladesh ties. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching India Sense with me, Gaurie Dwivedi. Now, shifting focus to Bangladesh, ever since Sheikh Hasina fled Dhaka, India and Bangladesh relationship has undergone change. One where routine issues like annual rainfall and subsequent flooding of areas evokes deep mistrust and suspicion. Parts of Tripura and Bangladesh witnessed heavy rainfall, and some in Bangladesh, in fact, even attacked India for acting in haste. Now, in this backdrop, let's get in Mahfouz Alam, editor of Daily Star, as a top voice on the show to speak about the political realities of Bangladesh and how India-Bangladesh relationship has undergone a sea change. Mahfouz Alam, thank you so much for speaking to me on NDTV. My first question to you is, as things stand now, there's been a couple of weeks since the turmoil came in Bangladesh. Is it now limping towards normalcy?
Well, it's a very tall order, honestly speaking, because, when you have a very powerful government over a long period of time and it suddenly collapses, there's a huge vacuum of power. Take, for example, our secretariat, which is the central secretariat, very, very powerful governance institution. Now, over the last 15 years, there have been many partisan appointments, and 11 secretary level people have been on contract after they retired. So those 11 people have been removed, and many of the secretary level or very high level bureaucrats who have been known to be patronized by the Awami League government are not now coming to office or in hiding. So how do you replace these people at that level? So there is, if you like, a big Himalayan task in front of the interim government to get the government going. And then there is now a new trend where people are coming up and saying, my promotion has been held back because I was not towing the line. I've been deprived this and that, so I should be reinstated, given our seniority from back date. All these, in a way, non-issue to the government are now plaguing the governance process. So to make a long story short, they are facing a lot of challenge, but normalcy has, if you like, returned in the marketplace. Supply chain is back. Prices of things are within limit. I mean, we already were facing high inflation, but that's where we are. Nothing dramatic has happened.
But if normalcy has returned, then why are elections not being held then?
Now, this is quite a, if you like, complex issue for Bangladesh. Since 91, when autocratic government of Ershad fell, we returned to democracy. But our democracy in that sense ultimately resulted into a two-party, not system, but two-party quarrel, which became bitter and bitter and bitter. So when Awami League was in power, BNP was the worst thing in the world. When BNP was in power, Awami League was incarnation of devil. So instead of a two-party politics taking a structure, instead of two-party politics bringing in institutional democracy and all that, we went the opposite direction. And so ultimately, there is a strong voice at the moment now that reforms first, election later. Now, this is a very, if you like, a very, it's a proposition pregnant with a lot of pitfalls, lot of possibilities, but there is a strong feeling about it. For example, there is a demand from the student and from the civil society that we should have constitutional amendments that will prevent the recurrence of such a, if you like, autocratic government's revival. We should have, like in our constitution, the prime minister enjoys absolutely unparalleled power. The president really has no power, unlike in India, where there is some sort of a resemblance. And because of the dominance of Awami League, there was nothing practically called an opposition. The parliament was dysfunctional practically. So there's a lot of demand that we go back to democracy, but with with amendments to the constitution, with checks and balance, that we never go back to such a, if you like, one party oppressive, stifling, a government.
Then let me ask you about the India-Bangladesh relationship. BNP wants Sheikh Hasina's extradition. There are some suggest that India is even releasing water without giving Bangladesh any notice. How do you see now the India-Bangladesh relationship in the new interim government?
I don't see that happening because, yes, BNP may have its own agenda, but honestly speaking, Sheikh Hasina's extradition to Bangladesh or something is really not in the main agenda of either the interim government or of the students who are now quite an influential actor in the political scene. So I don't think there will be a resurgence of demand for her extradition. And our foreign advisor, who has already publicly announced that her presence in India will in no way affect our bilateral relations. So I don't see that emerging as a vital concern for India-Bangladesh relations.
Mahfouz Anam, that's a very important point that you are making. That's a sane remark that is coming in from Bangladesh. But I want to ask you a larger question. The power play that is at play right now between US, China, India, in Bangladesh, it is a very strategic location in the Indo-Pacific.
Actually, I mean, in India, you do have your own perspective about China and China getting more influence here and there. So I respect your perspective. But from where I sit and where the daily Bangladesh politics is unfolding, the China card is not very obvious. And it has never been that obvious. We saw them more as a development partner, a lot of funding to our projects. So many people feel that China enters into a country's political sphere through their funding of projects. So to that extent, there has been, if you like, a transformation, because historically, when BNP was in power, we were closer to China. When Awami League was in power, we were closer to India. But to Hasina's, I think, great credit, she was the first prime minister who was able to take India's relationship with India to greater heights, but also bring in China into the overall scene in Bangladesh. So Sheikh Hasina's credit is that she had China as a development partner and she had India as a development partner. While India may have not been so happy with Hasina going so close to China, or China pressurizing Hasina that why are you so close to India, whatever may have been the scene under the surface, but she managed a very delicate and a very, if you like, successful relationship. So China's presence in Bangladesh is only through projects, big projects, and India's presence has been always very prominent. Hasina was very close to it. Now, the third party, if you like, is the US.
Yes.
Now, there is a popular perception, particularly in India, I have seen, that, Hasina was a big critic and publicly so of US. And then Professor Yunus is a highly respected person in the US. So the new dispensation must have a hand of the US underneath.
Okay, let's see how this relationship actually plays out. Mahfouz Anam, thanks so much for speaking to me on India Sense. On to Tech Tracker segment of the show. 7 years after Supreme Court came out with its landmark judgment guaranteeing right to privacy as a fundamental right, the government is all set to release draft rules under the Digital Personal Data Protection Act, or the DPDP Act. The rules aim to put India's digital landscape at par with global norms. But here's a comparison with the EU, which has the most robust digital regulation framework anywhere in the world. Now, EU's rules apply to organizations processing EU residents' data anywhere in the world. They also give individuals more control over their data, including the right to restrict processing. India's rules must work towards empowering their citizens in a similar fashion. The EU rules requirement for organizations to document processing of data and grievance redressal mechanism should also be part of India's final rules. These are draft rules, of course. They are open to public suggestions. And my hope is that the final ones that come out truly lay the foundation of a digital India. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of India Sense. Thanks so much for watching.